and good afternoon. My name is David Levy-Faur, and this is part of a webinar series on issues of governance, regulation and governance, different issue, different perspective, and so on. And today I have the honor to host two of the authors of a recent paper that was published by the journal Governance. And the topic is trends in governance in the journal Governance. This paper covers about 40 years, 45 years, and it speaks about the trends in the analysis. Two of the authors are here, Kyungdong Kim, I hope I pronounced it well, and Min-Han Kim. And the third one, Guy Peters, is not. So thank you so much for taking part in the series and presenting your work. I will say that Min-Han Kim is from the Department of Public Administration, College of Policy Law at Kwangwon University in South Korea. And Kyungdong Kim is from the Department of Public Maritime Administration, College of Maritime and Humanities and Social Science at the National Korea Maritime and Ocean University, again, South Korea. Thank you so much, and the floor is yours. I understand that Min-Han Kim will present, so please go on.
So everyone sees the screen all right?
Yes.
Just checking.
Excellent.
Okay. As introduced by Professor Levy-Faur, I am Min-Han Kim, one of the co-authors of the study that I'm presenting today. For starters, I thank Professor David Levy-Faur for the opportunity to share our work, as well as the guest commentators and also Governance Journal editors, Professor Graziano and Professor Shane Gate, although they haven't joined us yet. I'm sure they will join us very soon. A very brief announcement first. Professor Peters tried to have his schedule reorganized, but was unable to do so. He must serve on a panel evaluating proposals for a research foundation, an obligation he had planned in advance of this webinar. However, he told me that he very much looks forward to watching the recorded session of this. The other co-author, as introduced by David Levy-Faur, Professor David Levy-Faur, Kyungdong Kim is here with us. In preparing this presentation, I reviewed recordings of past speakers and noticed that their presentations averaged about 30 minutes. So I will aim to follow a similar pace. Let me begin by situating what this study sets out to do. This project traces the intellectual evolution of governance as both as a concept and a field, using the journal Governance as a longitudinal archive spanning roughly 35 years, from the late 1980s through 2023. The premise is straightforward yet analytically demanding. If governance scholarship both reflects and shapes real-world governing practices, then systematically examining what has been published over time offers a window into broader transformations in public administration and political science. So let me now turn to the motivation behind the study. So it is quite simply, why look back? Over the past 3 decades, the transformation of government has not occurred in isolation. It has been both mirrored in and at times shaped by academic scholarship. In other words, the literature on governance is not just descriptive. It has been part of the broader process through which governing itself has evolved. Starting from that premise, we approached governance as more than a journal. It sort of functions as an umbrella space, one that brings together different theoretical traditions empirical context, and methodological approaches. Despite this centrality, however, its development over time, especially in terms of how topics have shifted and accumulated, has not been systematically mapped. So this raises a set of fairly direct but important questions, at least to us. First of all, how has the journal responded to the continuing transformation of executive politics as governing arrangements become more complex, more hybrid, and often more contested? Has the scholarship kept pace? Second, to what extent has the content of the journal reflected the realities of what we might call turbulent times, periods marked by crisis, institutional strain, and political uncertainty? And finally, what can we actually learn from this accumulated body of work? If we take 35 years of scholarship seriously, does it tell us something meaningful about whether the field of governance is heading? These questions collectively frame the analytical starting point of our study. So let me now briefly walk you through the methodology we adopted for this study. So at a broad level, we rely on what can be described as a hybrid, or more precisely, an abductive approach. The idea here is to move beyond predefined classification schemes and instead combine data-driven techniques with domain knowledge. This allows us to identify patterns inductively while still interpreting them in a theoretically meaningful way. On the quantitative side, we employed natural language processing, specifically BERTopic, which is a transformer-based topic modeling technique. The data set consists of 900 abstracts published in Governance between 1990 and 2023. The purpose of the stat is relatively straightforward: to uncover latent topic structures in the corpus without imposing strong prior assumptions. In that sense, it gives us an empirical map of how themes cluster and evolve over time. At the same time, we are aware that algorithms, however powerful they can be, have certain limits. They tend to capture patterns in word usage, but they do not fully grasp context, nuance, or theoretical significance. So this is where the qualitative component comes in. We complement the quantitative analysis with thematic interpretation grounded in domain expertise. This allows us to engage with more complex ideas, such as debates around governance without government, that are very difficult to isolate through automated methods alone. So the value of this design lies in the interaction between the two components. The quantitative analysis provides structure and breadth, while the qualitative analysis adds extra depth and interpretation. Together, they allow us to produce what we refer to as a more comprehensive synthesis of the field, one that is both empirically grounded and conceptually informed. I just covered this. So let me now walk you through sort of in a bit more detail how we mapped the 900 articles. We begin with the input data, specifically 900 abstracts published in Governance between 1990 and 2023. We focus on abstracts because they provide sort of a standardized summary of each article's core argument, which makes them suitable for longitudinal comparison. From there, we move to feature extraction using sentence BERT. The key point here is that we do not treat each abstract as a single block of text. Instead, we analyze it at the sentence level and then aggregate those representations through mean pooling. This allows us to generate a single vector for each document while ensuring that no single part of the abstract disproportionately drives the results. In other words, shorter and longer abstracts are treated on equal footing. So once we obtain these document-level embeddings, we apply dimensionality reduction using UMAP. This step compresses the high-dimensional semantic information into more sort of a manageable space. in our case, 5 dimensions, while preserving the relative similarities between documents. The goal here is to retain as much of the underlying semantic structure as possible. Finally, we perform a cluster using HDB scan, which is a density-based algorithm. Unlike methods that require us to pre-specify the number of clusters, HDB scan allows the data itself to determine how many meaningful groupings exist. Through this process, we identify 19 distinct topics, which we then organize into 4 broader conceptual clusters. So taken together, this pipeline allows us to move from raw textual data to a structured representation of the field, one that is empirically grounded and sensitive to nuanced differences in meaning. So let me now turn to the geographical dimension of the field, which reveals a fairly striking pattern over time. Well, at least it was very striking to us. So what we observe here is that governance scholarship has undergone a clear shift in its geographic center of gravity over the past 3 decades. In the 1990s, the field was very much dominated by Americans, basically. So roughly 55% of authorship came from the United States, compared to about 25% from Europe. Additionally, the level of concentration was quite high, as reflected in the Herfindahl-Hirschman measure. In practical terms, this suggests that a relatively small number of countries, the US in particular, played a central role in shaping the early trajectory of the journal. So moving forward to the post-2010 period, however, we see sort of a noticeable shift. European authorship rises to nearly 50%, while the US declines to around 35%. Sort of at first glance, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index remains high, which might suggest continued concentration. But what is important here is that within Europe, there is greater dispersion across countries. In other words, while the continental share is concentrated, the national level diversity has actually increased. So what is the interpretation of this? The key takeaway is not simply that Europe has become more prominent, but that the field itself has become more geographically distributed. The intellectual center of governance studies has expanded across the Atlantic Ocean rather than being anchored primarily in one national context. So this shift matters because it brings a wider range of institutional experiences, policy contexts, and theoretical perspectives into the conversation, thereby reshaping how governance is studied and understood. Let me now turn to the what we might call the core analytical output of the study. So the architecture of governance research as it emerges from the data. So using the topic modeling approach I described in the previous slides, we identified 19 distinct subtopics in the journal, which can be grouped into 4 broader dimensions. These dimensions provide sort of a useful way of organizing how governance has been studied over time. The first, and by far the largest, is structure, which accounts for about 57% of the corpus. This dimension focuses on institutional arrangements, key actors, and system-level reforms. It includes familiar themes such as administrative reform, European Union institutions, and regulatory governance. In many ways, this reflects the traditional emphasis of public administration and formal structures and institutional design. The second dimension is mechanisms at roughly 20%. The focus shifts from structures to how governance actually operates in practice here. Things like transparency, corruption control, state capacity, local government performance, and so on. So rather than asking what institutions look like, this trend asks how they function. Third, we have process, which makes up about 60% of the articles. This dimension captures the design and implementation of policy, including environmental governance, policy instruments, and institutional dynamics. It is more concerned with how governance unfolds over time and across different arenas. Finally, there's democracy, which accounts for sort of a smaller share, around 7%, but nonetheless remains analytically distinct. This dimension focuses on regime types, democratization, and governance in non-Western context, East Asia in particular. Taken together, these four dimensions offer a structured way of understanding the field, not as a single unified conversation, but as a set of interconnected strands, each emphasizing different aspects of governance. Let me now take a closer look at the first two dimensions, structure and mechanisms, and how they relate to one another. Starting with structure. This is the largest dimension in the data set, accounting for over 500 articles. Conceptually, it refers to the foundational arrangements of power, formal institutions, organizational hierarchies, and system-level reforms. So much of this work is anchored in themes such as NPM, welfare state debates, and traditional political structures. In that regard, it reflects a long-standing orientation in public administration toward institutional design and reform. At the same time, what we observe is that while structure remains dominant, its relative prominence has been gradually declining. This does not mean that institutions are no longer important, but rather that the field is moving beyond viewing governance primarily through statist frameworks. So this brings us to the second dimension, mechanisms. Compared to structure, this is smaller in scale, but it is where we see sort of a very noticeable increase in scholarly attention. Here, the focus shifts to the capacities that make governance systems actually work in practice. Issues such as corruption control, transparency, state capacity, and local level performance. So if structure asks what governance looks like, mechanisms asks how it functions. So what is interesting is the relationship between the two. Rather than replacing structure, the rise of mechanisms suggests rebalancing. There is a growing recognition that formal arrangements alone do not explain outcomes, and that we need to pay close attention to the operational capacities embedded within those arrangements. In this context, this shift captures a broader movement in the field, from sort of an emphasis on institutional forms toward a more grounded understanding of how governance operates on the ground. So as for the other two dimensions, process and democracy, which in many ways capture the more dynamic and contextual sides of governance. Starting with process. This dimension includes about 150 articles and focuses on what we might call the temporal activation of governance. In contrast to structure, which emphasizes relatively stable institutional arrangements, process is concerned with how governance unfolds over time, how policies are designed, implemented, and coordinated across different levels and sectors. Substantively, this includes areas such as policy instruments, environmental and climate governance, and the evolving role of international organizations. So what is noticeable here is the shift away from viewing institutions as sort of fixed permanent entities toward examining how they operate in motion. In that sense, this dimension helps us understand how governance mechanisms are actually coordinated, often across jurisdictions and over extended time horizons. The fourth and last dimension, democracy, is smaller in scale, about 61 articles, more precisely speaking, but it is conceptually distinct nonetheless. It focuses on governance within different regime contexts outside traditional Western democratic settings in particular. Much of the work here centers on East Asia, examining issues such as policy innovation, economic transformation, and political transitions within authoritarian or hybrid regimes. So what makes this dimension interesting is that it introduces variation in the broader environment within which governance takes place. it sort of reminds us that governance is not a one-size-fits-all concept, but is shaped by regime type, political institutions, and regional context. So altogether, these two dimensions extend the analysis beyond structures and capacities toward a more dynamic and context-sensitive understanding of governance. So let me now bring these dimensions together and show how they sort of evolve over time. So what you see here is the longitudinal distribution of the four clusters across the full period from the early 1990s to the early 2020s. The key point is not any single year, but the broader trajectory. To begin with, structure consistently dominates the field. It remains the largest share throughout the entire period, which reinforces the point that governance research has long been anchored in institutional arrangements and formal structures. That said, the trend line is not entirely stable. There is a gradual sort of a softening over time, suggesting a slow shift away from purely structural explanations. By contrast, what stands out most clearly is the rise of mechanisms after around 2010 in particular. We see a noticeable increase in attention to issues such as accountability, transparency, and functional capacity. In other words, the focus is moving toward how governance works in practice rather than simply how it is organized. Process remains present, but comparatively stable, fluctuating at a sort of a moderate level. It continues to capture interest in policy design and implementation, but without the same upward trajectory we see in mechanisms. Democracy remains the smallest cluster and shows some variation, but does not exhibit a strong long-term increase. Its importance, therefore, lies more in its distinctiveness than its scale. So put together, the pattern suggests a gradual reorientation in the field from sort of an emphasis on institutional design toward a closer examination of functional execution. Not really a sharp break, but sort of a steady shift in emphasis. Let me now turn to what we found through qualitative interpretation, moving away from the quantitative results. Essentially, what the algorithms did not fully capture. Sort of a common assumption in the governance literature, especially since the 1990s, has been the rise of what is often labeled governance without government. The idea here is that networks, private actors, and non-state institutions increasingly operate independently of the state. However, when we sort of look closely at the governance journal itself, this assumption is not strongly supported. As a matter of fact, references to fully autonomous network governance are relatively sparse. Instead, what we consistently observe is that the state remains a central actor, both in terms of authority and accountability. So rather than governance without government, what the evidence suggests is something closer to governance with government. So that is, even when governance involved like sort of multiplicity of actors in a public, private, or hybrid, the state continues to play a coordinating and, in many cases, ultimate role. So this leads us to a more nuanced interpretation. The key development is not the erosion of the state, but the emergence of hybridity, arrangements in which authority is shared across actors, but not fully displaced from public institutions. This is precisely the kind of insight that is difficult to extract from topic modeling alone. So the algorithms can identify clusters and patterns, but they do not easily capture sort of the underlying theoretical implications. So the slide you are seeing at the moment highlights an important point. Combining quantitative and qualitative approaches It's not just a methodological choice. Rather, it is necessary if you want to fully understand how how governance is actually conceptualized in the academic literature. So let me now turn to what we see as sort of a more conceptual issue emerging from the literature, what we would call a normative gap. A recurring pattern in governance research is that the concept itself is sort of very difficult to measure. As a result, the field often gravitates toward attaching qualifiers like terms like good governance, democratic governance, or corporate governance, what have you. These labels are useful, but they also have a tendency to fragment the concept into subtypes that are easier to operationalize rather than confronting sort of the very core idea of the concept in sort of a direct manner. So what this slide suggests is that we may need to shift our analytical focus. Instead of treating governance primarily as a noun, something to be categorized and measured, we might think of it more as a process or sort of an activity. In other words, to move from governance to governing. So framed this way, the central question becomes less about identifying types of governance and more about understanding how governance actually occurs, how political systems steer, coordinate, and respond to complex societal challenges. This is in many respects a return to sort of a fundamental question in political science. How effectively do political systems exercise authority and direction? And how do they do so under different institutional and contextual conditions? So the implication here is not to abandon existing categories, but to place greater emphasis on the act of steering itself. So that shift, we would argue, opens up a more direct engagement with the core dynamics of governance as it operates in practice. So let me now step back and bring this finding together into sort of a broader interpretation of where the field appears to be heading. If there's a single thread that runs through the analysis, it is this shift from thinking about governance as a noun to thinking about governance as a verb. That is moving away from treating governance as a fixed object of study and toward understanding governance as an ongoing set of practices. This shift can be unpacked in a few ways. First, we see a movement from static to more dynamic perspectives. So earlier work associated with NPM in particular tended to emphasize relatively rigid institutional structures. More recent work, by contrast, is increasingly concerned with adaptation, experimentation, and change over time. Second, there is a move from silos to hybridity. The traditional distinction between public and private actors is becoming less analytically useful. Instead, governance is more often understood as involving integrated, co-produced arrangements that cut across sectors. And third, there is a shift from design to execution. Rather than focusing primarily on how systems are formally constructed, there is growing attention to how they function in practice, especially under conditions of uncertainty and/or crisis. So, taken together, these shifts do not suggest a complete break with earlier approaches. Rather, they point to sort of a gradual reorientation in emphasis, one that places greater weight on process, interaction, and performance. So sort of the broader takeaway is not that governance has been redefined entirely, but that the way we study it is becoming more attuned to the realities of governing in complex and evolving environments. So let me sort of wrap up by briefly outlining where this line of research might go from here. Based on the retrospective analysis, we see three broad directions that appear salient for future work. First, democratic backsliding. The rise of populist politics in many contexts raises questions about the politicization of public administration and the resilience of democratic institutions under pressure. For governance research, this suggests a need to look more closely at how administrative systems respond when the boundaries between politics and administration become less stable. Second, what we refer to as authoritarian nuance. As global power dynamics shift, there is increasing recognition that governance cannot be understood solely through Western democratic frameworks. So this opens up space for more systemic analysis of governance mechanisms within authoritarian and transitional regimes, focusing not only on constraints, but also on how policy is formulated and implemented in those contexts. Third, digital and algorithmic realities. As digital technologies continue to scale, governance is increasingly mediated by algorithms, platforms, and data infrastructures. This raises sort of a new set of questions around accountability, transparency, and control when decision-making processes become less visible and more technically complex. Um, so in sum, these directions point towards sort of a field that is expanding both substantively and analytically. The common thread across them is a shift toward engaging more directly with the conditions under which governing takes place, whether political, institutional, or technological. So rather than a single unified agenda, what we see is a set of evolving challenges that invite governance research to broaden its scope while remaining attentive to its core concerns. So let me close by returning to sort of the broader implication of what we have discussed. One of the clearest takeaways from this analysis that the study of governance can no longer be treated as something insulated from the broader environment in which it operates. The past few decades have been marked by recurring crises, economic, whether that be economic, political, environmental, and these conditions have increasingly shaped both the practice of governing and the way it is studied. In that context, as such, the field is being pushed toward a more grounded orientation. Rather than focusing primarily on institutional design in the abstract, there is sort of a growing attention to mechanisms, how governance actually works in practice, and to hybridity, that is the interaction between public and private actors in complex systems. At the same time, questions of democracy remains central as institutions face new forms of stress and contestation. So these trends, mechanisms, hybridity, and democratic practice are not separate, but they are getting increasingly intertwined. So what this suggests is a sort of a shift in the role of scholarship itself. So the aim is not only to describe or categorize governance, but to engage more directly with the conditions under which governing or governance takes place. And in doing so, the expectation is that research does more than reflect reality. Ideally, it also contributes, however modestly, to improving how governing systems function. So in that sense, the trajectory of the field points towards sort of a closer alignment between analytical insight and practical relevance. That is all I have for the webinar, and I
No, I'm
believe
sorry. You have more because we are going to ask questions. So
Oh, okay. Very good.
so you can
Okay,
contribute
thank you.
as well. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for the presentation, and thank you all for taking part. I've many reactions, but I'd like to hear my colleagues here more. I will just say one at this stage. Uh, my impression is that the qualitative analysis is much more interesting than the quantitative one, despite the fact that the quantitative analysis is technically fascinating. So I'd like to know how you do that. But this is not the main issue. Um, and I will not even give you the opportunity to react. Just invite people to to speak and to give their own views on that. So who wants to start? Michael, please.
So I'm here as a editor emeritus of governance. I was co-editor, I'm not quite sure, but in the 2000s. So it's actually a pleasure to listen to this presentation. I'd have to say the directions that you are pointing to are ones that I was pushing as co-editor. So kind of delighted to see all of that. So I want to pick up, I guess, on a couple of the relative loose ends. I mean, it was very tight, but even in tight presentations, there's a loose end or two. The first one is what you call the normative gap. I'd like to maybe have you explore that a little bit more. What I heard overall is that, in particular from the conclusion, that governance has a purpose, and we have to understand how it is fulfilled and how it isn't fulfilled, and that might be useful to know, which poses some interesting research methodology challenges. But when you brought up normative gap, it seemed like in a slightly different connection. So that's why I think it's a bit of a loose end. What I heard from normative gap, we went from that to saying, well, this has led to a lot of adjectival forms of governance, good governance and so forth. And then you went from there to say, well, we shouldn't really have a typological kind of approach. That is to say, our generalizations about governance shouldn't just be about these adjectival forms of governance, which I would agree with. But I kind of lost you on what you thought normative gap really means on the whole throughout this discussion. And I have another issue, but I'll leave it at that for the moment because there may be extra time to pursue the second question.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that comment. And just very briefly to elaborate on that, what I meant by normative gap was that so there is a gap between or sort of a disconnect between how governance is conceptually evaluated and how governing actually operates in practice. That's what I meant by it. But maybe, as you said, it was not really sort of reflective of that disconnect there. That term was not really, that doesn't really correspond to that disconnect, maybe. So I think that's a very fair comment, and maybe I shouldn't have said it, but but
I didn't say it, I wouldn't have asked a question. So thank you for saying it.
Yes. Anyone else that want to join discussion? Michael, I know that you have more to say. Maybe I'll take one and then you take. So during our kind of discussion and the lecture, I said to myself, okay, maybe it will be interesting to see which topics were the most cited. And I went back to my computer and my AI, and it seems again and again, I was not surprised. Dave Dolovich and March paper on learning from abroad is still the most cited paper, and then Ben Kishore on environmental governance and public policy, and the NPN is also new public management is also that important. But maybe I will ask both of you or all of you here what, and actually you mentioned that. So how did we during the last 35 years, not 45 as I mentioned before, how did we change the concept of governance? What came to be included? And I think you said something very important. This is now governance with government. So there are more private actors, which is very important. But maybe one of the most missing element in the agenda of the journal governance is the polycentric analysis of politics. This notion of polycentric governance, and even more important, the issues of backlash against polycentric governance that you see in the United States most strongly, perhaps, or very strongly, or surprisingly strongly, is fascinating. So polycentric literature, and here it's not only it's also the work of Julia Black, which is important, not only Ostrom. And when I'm looking now at I will stop in a minute. If I'm looking now at what's going on in the United States, you see deregulation, extreme effort of deregulation, but also centralization of power in the hands of the president, which I take as a backlash not only against democratic liberal democracy, but also against polycentric ways of governance. So my comments, and the floor is open for all of you.
Really briefly on your comments that yeah, I mean, I think polycentric governance is not just relevant, but it is really sort of the latent theoretical logic sort of underlying the themes, sort of the broad themes of governance as a journal, even when not explicitly foregrounded in the journal. I mean, so overlapping jurisdictions, relative sort of relative autonomy of actors. I mean, and those reasons are why we need coordination through sort of competition, cooperation, and sort of mutual adjustments are sort of needed. I mean, so I think it's implied there, polycentric governance. I mean, it's not been that explicitly elaborated by the authors of the governance journal, but it's always been there. But yes, I mean, in sort of future studies, yeah, I mean, I'd be more than happy to see more of those works, more explicitly stated and investigated.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, your comments on this or any other issues that you may want to bring?
Yeah, I have a couple. One is has to do with your directions at the back, which sound like what almost any journal, but roughly in this area would ask for. So I'm just wondering if something that is a counter statement might be welcome. One of the things I didn't hear much about is public administration as an old topic. Um, Even as the journal from the beginning was partly had one foot in public administration, one foot in executive politics, and maybe one foot in some of the normative issues you were discussing. Um, it might be worth thinking about why that's not on your list. Okay. It's not a criticism, but you might want to give some thought to it. And that leads into my second question, which is the more substantive one. So for some reason, maybe it's the way you decided to do the quantitative work, or maybe it's just the way the algorithms worked. There wasn't a dimension about what you were calling the way we study or how we study. So it was all kind of what we see when we are studying. Um, so I guess one sort of open-ended question is, Do you think it would be hard to ask those questions in an insightful way with your quantitative methodology? Um,
You,
do you have
do
any
you, do you
insight?
mean the methods of studying when you say how we study?
Yeah, something, I mean,
Method.
research practice, not methods for like data analysis necessarily, but commitments to how we study, theoretical ideas as about how we study that are introduced, which are distinct from at the margin the content of what we're studying. I mean, I note this because one of the things I published in government was only about how we study and not about any and about public administration. But I was just wondering if this was left out of the picture by design or just by the way the algorithms worked, why it wasn't picked up and compensated for by the domain knowledge on the qualitative side. So, any thoughts about that?
Well, here's an irony here. I was doctored by Professor Guy Peters. He's a political scientist, but he doctored me in public administration studies. So that sort of speaks to my sort of public administration to me is not as exciting for me as political science is. So that might be one of the reasons I paid extra attention to sort of elaborating more on sort of political science aspects of the journal than public admin. I mean, it sounds like a lame excuse, but
Well,
um,
genetic,
well,
I took it as an explanation, not as an excuse.
uh, okay, thank you. And sort of how we approach governance, that is something that we've sort of paid less attention to, if not overlooked. And that's a very fair comment, except that there were some methodological issues in terms of how to address those questions you've just raised. I mean, some of these techniques are now we can leverage some of these techniques to further delve into some of those how these studies were conducted and how they've methodologically approached governance and so forth. But back then, BERTopic has certain limitations uh, 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 inhibiting us from um, sort of approaching that matter in sort of a more multi-layered manner, so to speak. Is that sort of an explanation? Satisfying explanation? Maybe, maybe not.
Oh, it sounds like a mix of the way you did the quantitative work and what your interests were. But it sounds like maybe this is an area that you could pursue subsequently with similar methodologies.
Yeah, yes. I mean, one of the reasons we've stopped uh, 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 at 2023 was that, I mean, the very initial draft of this paper was produced back then, and we were sort of we moved on to something else I mean, after 2023, and now we're working something else. But definitely, as per your suggestion, I mean, we would definitely want to come back to this at some point and to sort of do a follow-up study on this for sure. Yes, and we'll definitely uh, pay extra attention to how public administration situates in this context too.
Yeah. Let me use this opportunity to ask Michael. You were the editor of governance at the time, as you mentioned. Um, so I'm curious to hear how did you find the journal? What was your major achievement? How do you see the journal today if you follow? Um, Michael, can you share with us?
I mean, it's going back quite some time, but I think my co-editor, Bob Cox, was more interested in the political science stuff. So I had, I sort of did political science, then I did management, then I did political science, and then I was moving back into management again about that time. So I think I was trying to open up a space for more public management, public administration interests in that regard. So, I would spend time in particular. I mean, sort of a lot of manuscripts needed developmental help. Okay. I don't know if it's probably today, there's no opportunity for editors to do developmental work, but I would go beyond the comments of the referees and try to make sense of them and try to provide guidance and a few additional comments of my own to a number of authors at each stage of the review process. Not that there were 15 stages or something like that. And I remember a lot of back and forth with Don Moynihan, for example, on one of his pieces about emergency management centers and this kind of thing. So I guess I don't know if I had accomplishments, but I put in a lot of time with certain people to push them in some directions. And I guess the second thing was a bit of an interest in essays where people were able to address the significance, not just the originality and rigor of the of work that they had been doing. So I had some relatively short essays about significance of work in the field, and I think that's important. And in the context of governance, significance can have to do with a lot of the issues that have been mentioned under the name performance and normative gap and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think I opened up space for those discussions and just had one of the co-editors, be really interested in public administration while the other wasn't.
I see. I see. And what are you working on nowadays? And how does it connect to the agenda, the long kind of looking?
If I may, so I'll go back to one of the publications I had in governance because my current work. A lot of work since then has been an extension of that. So in 2007, I published a piece on learning from secondhand experience, and it took as a point of departure one of the publications, methodological type publications by Eugene Bardak, who developed what he called smart practices analysis. Changed the name various times, but I think that was the name he went with in the end, smart practices analysis. And it was presented in his 2003 presidential election of the Association of Public Policy and Management. And if I could just say that sadly, Gene Bardak passed away this past week.
Oh, I didn't know. I didn't know.
So I laid out a way to do case studies and illustrated this approach, as I called it, with a case study from Brazil. And my 2009 book took that idea quite a bit, somewhat further, called Public Management as a Design-Oriented Professional Discipline. And what I've just finished is a manuscript that's a sort of sequel to that, which really, 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 develops a research practice for doing two things. One is understanding how governance things work, and the second thing is to draw lessons in the sense of providing domain knowledge about policy implementation in certain sectors, as well as domain knowledge about certain functions like steering or innovation and so forth. So the approach is called Design Recovery in Cases. And the title of the book is Public Management Recovering Designs Through Case Study Research. And it provides the research practice, some illustrations from other people's work in the past, like Judith Tendler, case study illustrating this approach in the context where innovating systems for delivery was the function, which Cheng-Hwan Kuo here co-authored with me. and then a philosophical part, which develops not only the idea of design recovery of endeavors, as I call it, but provides an account of the sort of discipline you have to have in mind if you're going to say this is what we should be doing in the academy. And that idea is called an endeavor-centered science of the artificial. So it goes back to Herbert Simon's science of the artificial idea, makes it more clear what he was arguing, so that we can distinguish between science of the artificial for endeavors like implementing public programs, running governments, as opposed to creating and using artifacts. And then there are two further case studies that are where the common function is overseeing the implementation of local delivery of public programs, and we explain how these worked in a couple of senses of the term, both in Brazil, where the oversight was done through auditing and investigation of local governments, and in the European Union, where the oversight was done through administration of the European Social Fund at the Commission level.
Excellent.
It's an open access book. It'll come out in a couple of months, and be happy to talk about it in some form like this.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, all of you. I will just say that maybe I'm so sorry to hear about Eugene Bardak's passing away. I met him almost 40 years ago in Berkeley first time. And then his daughter lives 1 kilometer from here. So I met him a few times when he visited there. But most important, I feel I didn't know him enough. And of course, his work, which is very, very, very interesting. Everything that I read from Eugene was excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much, all. Min Han Kim, do you want to say one more sentence to finish, to add something, or it's your...
Well, instead, do you mind I ask a very brief question to Professor Barzelay?
Please.
You've briefly touched on this, but if I may ask again, since we were not really scholars for most of the 35 years under study, we may not sort of fully grasp the context and sort of circumstances of that period. So my question would be that, do you sort of think our findings sort of align with what you have personally observed and experienced for the most part of that 35 years? I mean, that's sort of a very brief question that, I mean, you can basically answer yes or no.
I never do that, but I will say yes. But I guess my general response is everything you said, I am very happy to hear. Okay. And so if it's true, it's a great set of developments. Okay. My feeling a little bit is the story you tell is a bit better than the reality. But that's okay.
Okay.
So much.
I think there's some things that would be interesting about the, relation between these categories, right?
Right.
Because I think if you look at the relation between category 2 and category 3, which was mechanisms and processes, right? I mean, that's where my work is sitting right now, right? And I just part of the problem is we haven't, developed the right methodological or theoretical thinking to bring those together and close the normative gap. Okay. So, which I'm doing.
Okay.
So, I mean, I guess I generally felt you've set up nicely what I think my real contribution is, but I'm not sure that people will see it for what it is, given, but they could better using your framework. So I thought it was a very nice thing to listen to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And thank you, Professor Levi Fauer, for this wonderful opportunity. That's my very final concluding remark. Thank you for this.
My pleasure. Continue to do the good work and see you all in the next webinar, maybe with David Vogel in 2-3 weeks. See you soon. Bye.
Mm.